as you know, I was very much involved with the original JCPOA, but Trump has now, in what, 3 months, gotten further than what Biden got in 4 years.
From the Times, this is The World in 10. With me is Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C. Trita, welcome. We're hearing positive noises, really positive noises from everyone involved in this first round of talks. What's your take on how it went?
I do have to say that this round went as well as it possibly could have gone, in the sense that the indirect talks were for about 2.5 hours, and towards the end, clearly enough progress had been made so that the Iranians could be convinced to meet directly with Steve Witkoff, which then enabled both sides to have been truthful. The Iranians said that the talks would be indirect, Trump said that it would be direct, and it was both. And perhaps most importantly, they decided to meet within a week. And I think already at this stage, the conversation had gone into the territory in which greater technical expertise is needed. And that in and of itself is an indication that the approach Trump pursued here is one based on what he has repeatedly said, which is he just wants to make sure there's no nuclear weapon in Iran. To achieve that, you can go with a verification-based solution, which is pretty much what the JCPOA was, or you could have gone with what the Israelis were pushing for, which was Libya-style dismantlement. But Trump, I think, understood that under no circumstances would the Iranians accept dismantlement of their program. And that's a demand that essentially is put forward to fail in order to cause the collapse of the talks and move forward with military action, which is what Netanyahu in one of his video recordings kind of revealed is clearly his preference, not that it was a mystery. Trump has chosen not to do that because I think he genuinely wants a deal. And as a result, he's adopted a much more pragmatic, constructive approach. And this is part of the reason why this is going so fast. I mean, keep in mind, not trying to be partisan here or anything. As you know, I was very much involved with the original JCPOA. But Trump has now, in what, 3 months, gotten further than what Biden got in 4 years. Biden never got to a point in which Iranian and US officials at the foreign ministry level even met. And Trump has managed to get that. So I think from his standpoint, he can already now feel comfortable saying that he's doing better, which obviously is very important for him. But to be objective, he actually is doing better.
Given that Donald Trump tore up that earlier deal, what's made him so keen to come back to the table, to renegotiate with Iran now? And does he have the bandwidth with everything else going on to do it justice?
The bandwidth question is a fantastic question, and all of us here in Washington are kind of shell-shocked to see how fast he's moving on so many different issues. But particularly this issue, since it will become so technical, is probably going to run into some challenges at some point. But as to your earlier question, why does he want to do this since he tore up the nuclear deal? And in fact, part of the reason why the Iranians are so advanced in their nuclear program right now, and it's going to make it so difficult to go back to JCPOA levels, is because Trump walked out of this deal. That was a huge mistake in my view. But why does he want to do it now? I think, frankly, Trump wanted to get a deal in his first term as well. He was just sold a very problematic strategy that to him made sense. Bolton and Pompeo were the ones who were behind the strategy of maximum pressure, getting out of the deal, convincing him if we just sanctions the Iranians to death, they will come begging for a deal, and this is how you will get a better deal than Obama had. And on the surface of it, it obviously makes sense. Now, anyone who had any experience with Iran for the last 30 years could have easily told them that that's absolutely not going to work. It's going to make the situation worse. But I think he genuinely thought that that is an approach to getting a better deal. And this is part of the reason why this time around, not only is there no Bolton, who of course burned his bridges with Trump, but Pompeo worked very hard to get into the administration, and he was nixed. Nikki Haley was nixed. Brian Hook, all of the people who were associated with that strategy have been nixed. Now, he did sign the February 4th memo, which is very much the same strategy that they had put in place. In fact, I believe it was Brian Hook who wrote it. It was still on the desk, even though he was fired on first day. But as you may recall, Trump went out and said, I really don't want to do this. They say that I have to, but hopefully it won't come to it, etc. So he already expressed a lot of hesitation about it. The fact that he signed it had a very negative impact on the Iranians' willingness to get to the table. So this could have actually been done sooner had that memo never been signed. But nevertheless, they managed to overcome that, and they're here now. And Trump cherishes the idea of being a deal maker. And it's not these small, simple deals that he's attracted to. He's attracted to the big ones, the ones that no one else managed to get done. And this is part of the reason I think even Biden's former envoy to these talks, Rob Malley, said it in the New York Times just 2 days ago that one of the big differences that actually makes it more likely for sex this time around is that Trump is eager to get a deal, whereas Biden was lukewarm.
Eager to get a deal. What does Donald Trump have to offer to Iran?
I think one of the challenges that is going to be faced with is, of course, that the program has advanced so much, and it's going to be difficult to get it back to JCPOA levels. But Trump is willing to put a major carrot on the table that neither Obama nor Biden were even willing to contemplate. And that is what is called primary American sanctions. See, the sanctions that were lifted in the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015 that Obama negotiated, only lifted the secondary sanctions. Those are the sanctions that the United States imposed on British companies if they were to trade or invest in Iran. By lifting those, British, European, Russian, Chinese, Indian companies could go back into the JCPOA, into the Iranian market as a result of the JCPOA. And Trump already back then complained about that as being unfair because no American companies could go back in because the primary sanctions, the sanctions that target American companies, were never lifted. And part of the reason why those were not lifted is that it takes even more political juice and capital to get those lifted. Obama didn't want to go that far. He was afraid that the Republicans would muster even greater opposition to the JCPOA if he went that far. And as I mentioned, Biden was lukewarm, even about secondary sanctions relief. He didn't want to give anything, essentially. But Trump has always been upset about this because he complained that it was unfair that European companies can go into Iran and make money, but not American companies. So he already has a completely different approach towards this, in which he actually sees those sanctions to a certain extent as a punishment of American companies. Now, a critical thing that has changed in Iran is that back in 2015, the Iranians didn't want the primary sanctions lifted. The hardliners in Iran did not want to see American companies in Iran. They could live with a nuclear deal, but American companies coming into Iran, that was a red line. They were terrified, perhaps quite correctly, that American companies in Iran means American influence in Iran, which eventually would erode conservative grip on power. This time around, things have changed. The system as a whole seems to have come around to the logical conclusion, which is one, if you only have secondary sanctions relief, it won't work because European companies are simply not going to come back to the Iranian market unless they know they have the protection of knowing that they're not doing anything different from an American company. The reputational cost, all of these things. Remember, a lot of European companies have gone into Iran, been kicked out because of sanctions, gone back in, kicked out because of sanctions. They're not in the mood of playing this game any longer. If they're going to go in, they need stability. Stability can only be given through a degree of primary sanctions relief. And secondly, what happened with Trump when he came in? He went out of the JCPOA. So what's the value and durability of sanctions relief if American presidents can just willy-nilly go in and out of the deal, reimpose sanctions? It's not that high. But if American companies are in Iran, suddenly there's a political cost to reimposing sanctions because there's going to be a business community that will be opposing it. There was no American business community that opposed Trump pulling out of the deal in 2018 because they had no skin in the game. They were not in the market. In fact, they saw all of their competitors getting into the Iran market. Because of Trump having this very different attitude, because of the Iranians coming to the conclusion that secondary sanctions relief is somewhat meaningless, I think they're now at a state in which a much bigger deal actually can be struck, which then also creates the possibility of getting the Iranian nuclear program back to the levels of 2015, perhaps more, perhaps a little bit less, but nevertheless, getting it to there would actually be extremely good, and Trump would be able to say that he fulfilled his promise of preventing an Iranian nuclear bomb.
How much does Iran need relief from economic sanctions in general? Could this prompt them to perhaps give up more than they did back in 2015 in Vienna?
I think so. Well, going beyond that again is going to be really tough. Just getting back to it's going to be really tough because to just give you an understanding of how far they have advanced in their nuclear program. Back when they did the JCPOA, Iran only had enrichment to 20%, and they had a very small stockpile of that. That's the level you need for creating fuel rods for reactors. Now they have 60%, which is what you need to create fuel for submarines, nuclear driven submarines. But it's a significant distance closer to 90%, which is what you need to build weapons. So they're much closer. And already having mastered the technology to go up to 60% means that they already know how to get to 90%, which they were not there before. Moreover, there's a formula that actually was sold to the US under the Obama administration by the Israelis that is called breakout time. It means the amount of time it takes from the moment they make a political decision to build a bomb to them having the material for a bomb. Not a bomb, but the material for a bomb. Under the JCPOA, that time frame was always 12 months minimum because of a combination of restrictions, inspections. For instance, they could only have 300 kilos of LEU at a time on their own soil. You need 1,200 kilos for one bomb. They would not even have that material on their own soil. Because of a combination, the breakout time was always a minimum 12 months. Today, their breakout time is something between 3 to 5 days by most estimations. That doesn't mean that they can have a nuclear weapon to 3 to 5 days, but they can have the nuclear material for a bomb within 3 to 5 days. That's how far they have progressed. It makes it much, much more difficult to pull it back. By the way, when Obama began serious negotiations with Iran in 2013, their breakout time was 8 weeks. So he managed to pull it from 8 weeks to 12 months. Trump's going to have to pull it from 3 days to 12 months. So it is harder. And doing it without primary sanctions relief, I personally don't think is going to be possible. Now, do the Iranians need it? They absolutely need it. Their economic situation is very, very bad. I wouldn't say that they are on the verge of collapse because economic collapse or regime collapse, because they can still muddle through. They can survive, but they cannot thrive. And the rest of the region is thriving. I mean, Turkey's economy was smaller than Iran's 20 years ago, and now it's way ahead of it. It's part of the G20. The Saudis are moving really forward, modernizing their country, opening it up, pulling for this 2030 vision. Probably will not be completely met, but nevertheless, they have made some significant strides forward. Of course, I don't have to explain to anyone how Doha and Dubai looks today, but 50 years ago, it was essentially nothing. For the Iranians to just survive is still to constantly lag behind. They need to be able to thrive. And when it comes to regime collapse, this regime is tremendously unpopular. It is corrupt. It is repressive. Its economic situation is disastrous. None of those criteria in and of themselves are sufficient for a revolution or regime collapse. You need to have a competent opposition, leadership, ideology, all of these different things, which has been missing in Iran, which has enabled a tremendously unpopular and incompetent, oftentimes, regime to survive because there isn't an alternative, because the ingredients for a revolution are not there. So my argument or my assessment is that they needed to thrive, not necessarily to survive. They're still surviving, but it's not a particularly dignified survival.
They've survived Iran and the US without formal diplomatic relations for decades now. You touched on the direct versus indirect talks issue a moment ago. How big a deal was it that there were even just a couple of minutes of FaceTime in Muscat on Saturday?
I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how big of a deal that is because, at the end of the day, it was Trump who pulled out of the deal. It was Trump that reimposed or imposed maximum pressure sanctions that went way beyond any of the sanctions the US had imposed before. And part of the reason why he could do that is because he did not care about the implications that would have for European companies. Part of the restraint of the Obama administration is they didn't want to go so far to really make it very difficult for Europe and other countries. Trump didn't care about that at all. So he had no constraints, and he didn't really care about how this would affect US's relations with other countries. And also, of course, this is the man that ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the Iran Quds forces. So for them to not only talk to the US under Trump, they even refused to do so during the first 4 years, which was a huge mistake. And I think they've come to realize it was a huge mistake. But for them to not only do that, but at the first meeting, even go forward with a face-to-face, there were no cameras there, so I suspect there also was a handshake. It is absolutely huge. And I think it's reflective of the fact that both sides need a deal, and both sides see an upside to a deal in a manner that they didn't do before. Keep one thing in mind. Trump, despite all of his theatrics, despite attacking the Houthis, has made strong promises of getting out of the Middle East and not getting into any new wars in the region. If this issue with Iran is not resolved, because it is going towards an escalation right now because of snapback sanctions expiring in October, Trump would be in a very bad situation under tremendous pressure to take military action. So both sides have an upside and a downside here, which has really sharpened their choices and has created this opportunity. But none of this would still have worked had there not been strong political will on both sides and an eagerness to get a deal. And that's where Trump's personal quality actually makes a huge difference.
The man who was at that meeting, Steve Witkoff, perhaps shook hands with Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. Could you talk me through where he sits in the kind of factionalism of Iran? Is he with the hardliners, the Revolutionary Guard, or is he with the reformists, the kind of moderates we talk about?
So Abbas Araghchi is a very competent Iranian foreign minister. He was part of the previous negotiations. He is not seen as being with the reformists, perhaps tilting closer to the conservatives, but those epithets have kind of lost meaning in Iran a little bit because of how much the political environment and spectrum has undergone changes. Perhaps not as big of changes as you have in the US, in which what does it mean to be Republican in the US today? It's really difficult to know because Liz Cheney Republican and a MAGA Republican are on completely two different planets. But he is seen as someone who really knows the file and is accepted essentially in all camps, and does have clearly the authority to do this. They would not have been sending their top diplomat for indirect talks unless they themselves knew from the outset that there is a high likelihood that there will be a need for direct talks, even at that first meeting. And incidentally, the entire delegation of the Iranian sent there was, I mean, they sent a very large and very experienced senior delegation there.
What's your sense as someone who's watched many of these negotiations over the years? As we look forward to a second round, perhaps more talks, what's the best and the worst outcome we could see?
I think we start off with the worst. I think if Trump is put under pressure to expand the agenda, and he wants to deal with Iran's missiles or its relations with Hezbollah and the Houthis, etc. I think that will create complications if it is part of at least an initial deal. You see, the JCPOA took about 2.5 to 3 years to negotiate, and all it focused on was the nuclear file. Now they have roughly 60 days to get a deal. And they have to then not only get a nuclear deal, but also get a deal on missiles and other things that have, there's been no progress on those issues ever before. So there's not even a blueprint to follow. I think that it would almost guarantee failure. So I think it's very critical that he really prioritizes what he has said, which I suspect is a reflection of his priorities, his only red line is a nuclear weapon. If that is the American approach, I think we have a decent likelihood of success. On the Iranian side, you have to really worry about hardliners trying to sabotage this. I think we've seen some very interesting positive signs. There is a gentleman there who runs the Iranian conservative paper, Kayhan, and he ran an article, I think it's now a little bit more than a week ago, saying something along the lines that Trump should be killed. And there was a firestorm within the system with several different entities within the Iranian system in a coordinated way, pushing back against him, asking for him being rebuked. And mindful of the fact that this person directly represents Ayatollah Khamenei, seeing him actually being pulled back and at least quietly rebuked, I don't think we have seen before. So you're seeing efforts by some conservatives to sabotage, but you're seeing an even stronger effort by others, including other conservatives, to shut them down and not let them sabotage this. Then you have the wild card in this, which is Israel, which has completely opposed any negotiations, any deal. They clearly did so under Obama. They did so under Biden. They didn't have to worry too much back then, I guess. And they will continue to do so now. I think they will be more careful than they were with Obama, because I don't think Trump will take it very lightly if they start using their pull in Congress to sabotage Trump. I think Trump will not tolerate something like that at all. And I think Netanyahu will be hesitant about confronting Trump in that type of a direct way. So instead, their way of sabotaging it may be that they will try to get the Iranians to back out. So I would not be surprised if in the next 60 days we see an increase in sabotage in Iran, assassinations in Iran, perhaps even something more bold and spectacular that will make it very difficult for the Iranians to continue the talks, that will shift the balance inside of Iran between those opposed to talks and those in favor of them. And perhaps even shift it in such a way that those who actually oppose talks because they want to get a nuclear weapon, which is a group inside the system that have become much stronger over the last 2 years because of Gaza, because of the way that Israel has been able to conduct its war without any constraints, any objections from Europe and the United States. This has really changed the conversation inside of Iran, in which the faction that felt that Iran needed the nuclear deterrence rather than just using a nuclear program as a bargaining chip became much, much stronger. So I would not be surprised that they would do things of that kind on the Iranian side instead, in order to get the Iranians to pull out or get into such an internal fight that they simply couldn't negotiate. Because that would be less politically risky than, confronting Trump directly or indirectly through Congress. On the best side, on the positive, I think that most, if they manage to get a nuclear deal before the October deadline, and then they begin negotiations on other issues, so that this is not just a one-off, but this is the beginning of a strategic reorientation by both Iran and the United States. Imagine how the Middle East would look like if the US and Iran were not just constantly at each other in all of these different arenas in the Middle East. Almost every conflict in the region has ended up becoming a theater in which the US and Iran are indirectly or directly supporting opposing factions or groups. It's been very destabilizing for the region, but it's also been something that has led to the United States feeling that it needs to stay in the Middle East. Trump wants to get out of the Middle East. Getting a deal with Iran is actually one of the smartest ways of paving the way for the US being able to exit the Middle East militarily. Because a key justification for the US being there with 50,000 troops is precisely the US-Iran enmity.
Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.